Grace to you and peace from God the Father and from the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. The Church has traditionally taken this last Sunday of the liturgical year as Christ the King Sunday, but it was not until 1925 that it was designated as a festival in the Roman Catholic Church by Pope Pius XI. Now, usually we Lutherans don't pay a lot of attention to papal decrees, at least not since the Reformation. But this particular one resonates for some significant reasons. Because in 1925, the world was in a very difficult, perhaps even cataclysmic state. On the horizon was the beginning of what was later to be called the Great Depression. World War I, the war to end all wars, had just recently ended. They were still wrangling over the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles. We hadn't signed it yet. And already on the horizon, another world war seemed to be looming, and no one seemed to be able to stop it. People were feeling a sense of anxiety and what today we like to call existential dread. They were searching for solutions. They were yearning for someone, anyone, to come and lead them out of their despair. And in the midst of those troubled times, three men kind of rose to the fore at the top of their nations. The first you've heard of, a perverse rabble-rouser by the name of Adolf Hitler, who got himself improbably elected the Chancellor of Germany as the leader of the National Socialist Party. Now, these are not your grandma's socialists, the ones that we like to talk about. These are different kinds of socialists. In Italy, a man by the name of Benito Mussolini, the original fascist, one of those strong men that Hitler very much admired, came to power along with a third man, Japan's premier, Hideki Tojo. These three would join to create what later became known as the Axis powers, the other side of the fence from the Allies who fought in World War II. But at this early juncture, they were just beginning to crank up their rhetoric, nationalist rhetoric, to show that they all had answers for the problems that everybody was afraid of. And most of those answers began by fearing someone else, the other. Now, the king of Italy at that time was a man named Victor Emmanuel III. He was a gutless wonder, and the reason was that he had also survived the First World War, and he was very scarred by the number of men and women and children who died, and so he refused to challenge Mussolini's rise, and as a result, without objection from everyone who knew better, Mussolini became the first of these three men to become the fascist dictator of a police state, and he fancied himself the emperor of a new Roman Empire, and he went out to conquer as many nations as he could. As the world continued to seek for answers and listen to these powerful men, the Roman Catholic Pope, the fourth guy here, named Pius XI, decided it was time for the Church to say something, that it had sat quiet long enough. And he wanted to remind the Christians under his aegis that everywhere our allegiance was not to those kinds of worldly leaders who vied for absolute power and rode in on the horse of fear. And so on December the 11th of 1925, Pope Pius XI instituted the festival of Christ the King, a way for churches to gather together and remember what it meant to have a king and to ponder the kind of king that we really wanted. And our world at that time was a mess. It's changed a lot, we might say, since 1925. Of course, World War II has come and gone, and Hitler and Tojo and Mussolini are just bad memories. But when I watch the news in the evening, I'm wondering if you feel the same as I do, that the more things change, the more they stay the same. Because the question of what kind of king we want is germane. In our nation, we've expressed a desire for someone to lead us out of our sense of anxiety and despair. We're looking for someone who will deal with our need for security. And we don't want somebody who is elite or educated or hoity-toity. We've heard these things before. In my lifetime alone, we've elected a peanut farmer, a movie actor, a television reality show host to varying degrees of success or failure. History will judge better than you or I. But what we have wanted amongst all of them is a king like us, somebody mundane, someone ordinary, someone you can have a beer with, as we used to say about George Bush. What they wanted in 1925 were the same kind of people. They wanted leaders who would provide them with solutions. What they ended up with was somebody who provided them with the final solution. And measured by mere numbers, the final solution that Hitler and his Nazis perpetrated upon history was not all that unique. 14 years of rule, they had killed over 6.5 million Jews. And we're not counting the homosexuals and the gypsies and the ne'er-do-wells and the malcontents and those whom they considered to be traitors. They killed them in places that we called concentration camps. I remember my first visit to one of those concentration camps. It was this one just outside of Frankfurt on the way to Berlin. I just sounded like an Ohioan, didn't I? I called it Berlin, didn't I? Oh, my God. Sachsenhausen was supposed to be the showpiece camp. When people wanted to know what was going on, they took them here to Sachsenhausen. On one side of the brick wall that surrounded that camp, you will find these small, charming little bungalows, gardens all around them, picturesque little Lutheran churches with stained glass windows, quaint little shops festooned with flowers. Walk 15 feet and cross over that brick wall, and what you would find are rifle pits, medical labs where horrendous experiments were conducted on the prisoners, and of course, crematoriums that burned bodies daily, night and day, for 10 years. Well, on the other side of that brick wall, neighbors walked the cobblestone streets and greeted one another with a warm Guten Tag. It's hard to imagine the smell, the sound, the sights, and yet the people said they had no idea, none, what was going on. You've heard of Pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He died in one of those camps, paying the ultimate price for his opposition to the Nazis. We romanticize his life, but we should be aware of his confession. The words he wrote in 1944 while awaiting death. He confessed his own complicity. He wrote these words: "We saw the lie raise its head, we did not honor the truth. We saw our brethren in direst need, but we feared only for our own safety. Now we come, confessing our sin." In 1939, another Lutheran pastor, Martin Niemöller, was arrested by the Gestapo for preaching against the Nazis. They accused him of being unpatriotic, a traitor to the fatherland. They also took him to a concentration camp, but unlike Bonhoeffer, he ended up in Sachsenhausen. He survived. And in 1946, addressing the newly organized United Nations, he shared these words, which I know you've heard before. "First they came for the communists, but I did not speak because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, but I did not speak because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak." Part of the horror of the Nazis is how ordinary they were. Just plain old folk. You know, the kind you live beside. The ones that you say, I don't get it, they were so quiet, so nice. Who would have thought they would have killed 30 people in the basement of their house, you know? We too are just ordinary people, and Christ the King is for us. But it's really hard to preach Christ the King Sunday amongst ordinary Americans, and I'll tell you why. There's 3 reasons. The first is that when we think of royalty, that's what comes to our mind. You know, an elderly lady with a fancy hat, a clutch purse, wearing pearls and sensible shoes, you know. Since the days of George III, we've not been real keen on royalty, except for Princess Diana. My wife was a big fan of her, so we'll set her aside. The second reason is that we have no sense of the church year in general or of the season of Pentecost in particular. So all of those wonderful or maybe frightening apocalyptic texts we just read 3 in a row, they tend to kind of go right over our head or befuddle us or have to do with something which has nothing to do with our everyday life. And the third reason is that when we talk about the word king to describe Jesus, it sounds like we're talking about something political. And of course, that misses the whole point of Luke's gospel, doesn't it? Because it comes down to a question. If Jesus is king, if God promises a king, what kind of king do we have and what kind of a king do we want? Because that's the question that Jesus put to those who crucified him. I want you to remember that just a week before this, Jesus entered into Jerusalem riding a donkey. It was a grand parade. They rolled out the red carpet, laid their cloaks on the ground before him, spread palm branches, and they all said, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the Son of David." That's political, by the way. And now in our text today, that same gospel, he is rejected, derided by these same leaders and these same people, mocked by soldiers. Even one of the criminals hanging next to him says, "What kind of king are you? Why can't you save yourself and us?" To which Jesus replies, "Well, what kind of a king do you want?" And they reply, they want a king who is powerful, a king that can save himself, a king that will take vengeance upon his enemies and will make things that are wrong right, and they'll do it right now. To which Jesus responds in a way, "Then you don't want me." Or maybe you do. And I wonder if Jesus were standing in this pulpit today preaching to you, if he would ask you any different kind of a question. What kind of king, what kind of a leader do you want? I wonder if we in the last week, we who live in these United States of America, might be asking a similar question. Regardless of your politics or your candidate, let me assure you, Jesus is not running for president, and if he were, he would lose. Period. Because like the people of Pope Pius's time, we want leaders that will grant us a measure of security and affirm our own prejudices. We want to be with those who share our opinions, who hate the people that we hate and fear the people that we fear. We want leaders that reflect our own limited vision, no matter how selfish it might be, not one who will cast a vision that calls us out of ourselves, out of our bubbles, out of our comfort zones. Those people don't get elected. We're afraid of them. We want a king who loves us just the way we are, but not enough to make us change who we are or how we are. We want a king that loves us without judgment or correction. And we are willing to compromise our integrity, vote for and accommodate someone who does not reflect the values we say we hold most dear, if we believe they'll give us security abroad and prosperity at home. We will vote for someone who promises us a better tomorrow, as both party candidates do all the time, rather than someone who challenges us to sacrifice, to dream of, and to live a better today. Tomorrow's a lot easier to ignore. Jesus is not that kind of a king. Jesus refuses to come in power, but instead comes on a cross in weakness. Jesus does not vow retribution for those who crucified him. Instead, he offers them forgiveness. Jesus doesn't come down off his cross to prove his kingly power. Instead, he remains on an instrument of torture and death to represent every human being who must undergo torture and death unjustly. Jesus does not promise us a better tomorrow. Jesus offers us redemption today, right here, right now, in your midst. He did not say to that repentant thief, somehow in the future, someday you will enter into God's presence. He says, this day you will be with me in paradise. This day, right now, this very moment. Christians are accused of pining for some distant, better future, and so sitting out the struggles and the challenges of today. But this day, in this story, Jesus focuses on the moment, promising that those who believe in him, that those who see in his vulnerability the revelation of God's gracious mercy, they will be ushered into God's presence right now. And he is not running for president. Maybe it's understandable that we seek leaders who will offer us a measure of strength and confidence, but Luke warns us against spiritualizing the kind of leadership that Jesus brings. In Luke's stories of the crucifixion, he emphasizes one dimension above all others, that Jesus is innocent. Notice the words of the repentant criminal when he rebukes his comrade. Indeed, we have been condemned justly. We are getting what we deserve. This man has done nothing wrong. And the verses that follow are even clearer, the ones we don't read. The centurion who sees his death says clearly this man was innocent. That's different from what the centurion says in Matthew and Mark, who says clearly this is the Son of God. No, it is not the pedigree of Jesus that Luke is concerned about. It's his innocence. Because here Jesus stands with every innocent of every time, every vulnerable and forgotten one who is or has or ever will be suffering for the injustices that the world perpetrates upon them. And when he is raised, he promises God's vindication to all those that the world ignores and discards and throws away. Jesus is not running for president, and we would not elect him if he did. But he does call those who confess him Lord to stand with the weak and the vulnerable. He calls the church that says it is his body in the world to stand with the weak and the vulnerable. For whatever our need for strength and security might be, Jesus calls us to care for the weak and the vulnerable, just like a parent cares for a child. And he led the way by leaving behind all the strength, all the security of his kingdom to empty himself, become obedient unto death, even the death of a cross, as Paul writes in Philippians. And so the answer for the 21st century is the same as it was in the first. What kind of king do you want? Not a king like Jesus. Except, of course, in those moments when, like that thief hanging on his left, we realize that there's different priorities. That if we got what we deserved, there would be no hope at all. That if we chose to live in a world where might makes right, we would always be on the losing side. If we preferred a world where there was an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, we would all be blind and toothless. So in those moments, Jesus comes to remind us that far from promising a better future, he has come to redeem the present, the now. He has come to set us free, to stand with him, and with all those who are in need, to see in them the presence of a king who takes the side of the weak and the vulnerable, who suffers unjustly for the sake of the world. Jesus may not be the kind of king that we want, but people, he is the kind of king that we need. And today is his day, his festival. And the task of his church is to celebrate the forgiveness and the redemption that King Jesus gives to our world so that we might hear his voice and answer his call. To God be the glory. Amen.